Hi, welcome to the Los Altos History Show. I'm Erin Finnegan, and I'll be your host this evening. With us tonight is Senator Alan Cranston, longtime local resident here in the area, getting his start in local politics at the Mountain View High School as president of the Boys League. He eventually spent 24 years serving on the United States Senate. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you and with the many people that listen and watch you.
Well, it's been fascinating. I've tried to do lots of research into your history, and it just goes on, and a fascinating career so far. I thought it might be nice, since it's the Los Altos history, if you'd give us some idea of your family's roots in the area, how you came to be here.
Well, both my mother and father were born in California, and I was born in Palo Alto, where they were living in 1914. They bought a place out here in Los Altos, and we all moved here in 1915. So that's when my life in Los Altos began.
Oh, great. Now, did they come to work doing orchard work, or what was the...
No, my father was in real estate.
Okay.
But he bought a place that had about 13 acres, including some apricot trees and a beautiful old barn. The place was called the Red Barn. We had a lot of animals, dogs and cats and chickens and ducks and cows and horses.
Oh, that's great. And was it a big change from where you'd been in Palo Alto coming?
Well, I don't really remember that, except the house is still there where I was born, where my family lived at that time. It's on Copper Street in Palo Alto, and next door to other houses. Although I guess it was more like country in 1914.
Definitely, up until recently, I think. So tell us a little about your early life in Los Altos. I'm curious how you decided to take the channel you did. Was it a conscious decision to go into public service for you? Or?
No, my original ambition was to be a foreign correspondent, to wander the world and have adventures and witness great events and interview famous people and write about all that. And I became one after I graduated from Stanford. I did some foreign correspondence before that while I was in school for the Mountain View Register Leader, a newspaper that existed in those days. But what I found myself doing was covering the evil deeds of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini in Italy and Germany and in Africa. And I decided after a couple of years of that I didn't want to spend my life writing about such unpleasant people. I'd rather be involved in the action. So I quit journalism, hoping that I could find a way to get into politics and government, and eventually I did.
Oh, how interesting. So it is interesting to me, our local museum here, the History House, focuses on the 1930s in Los Altos. So during this time that you were doing foreign correspondence, you were also attending Stanford and doing local writing. What was the political atmosphere in this area at the time?
It was a pretty conservative place at that time. It was Republican. I remember when Herbert Hoover, who came from here and was a Stanford graduate, he graduated in the first class, was elected president in 1928, and then in 32 he was defeated by Franklin Roosevelt. My memories, of course, go back into the late teens. I really remember the first time I stood up, which must have been about 1915.
Do you really?
Yeah, I do remember that far back, and I remember many things in the late teens, and a lot of things, of course, in the 20s. I went to Los Altos Grammar School in 1920 when I was 6 years old. I still have a couple of friends, one very nearby, that I met in the first grade. One is Harry Dutton, who's now living in the Sequoias. Another was Ralph Raymond, who's living up in the state of Washington now, and still a third is Jim Marshall, who lives at Menlo Park.
And
we all went through school together.
Oh, that's terrific. And you're still all in touch today.
Yeah, we are.
Now, you went to the grammar school that was on San Antonio Road, and then you went to the Mountain View
High
did. School?
Originally, people from Los Altos went to Palo Alto High School, but they changed that shortly before I got to high school, so I went to Mountain View.
So, and even though we know that you were president of the Boys League, you didn't have aspirations necessarily for politics at the time?
Not necessarily, although I was interested in politics, but I was more interested, frankly, in athletics at the time. I was on the football team and was a runner, sprinter, and quarter miler. And when I went on to Stanford, my father got me interested in athletics by taking me to Stanford events. He had been a Stanford graduate. He was in the class of 1901. And so I really, in effect, majored in track at Stanford. Technically, I majored in English, but I paid more attention to track. And actually,
and I heard you were on the mile relay team.
Yeah.
That was the fastest in the country.
Right.
So it was worth putting your attention into the track.
Yeah, it was. And I learned a lot from track. And I learned a lot about the need to focus. I should have been better than I was. I should have been in the Olympic Games in 1936. And I didn't quite make it. I was good enough to do it, but I just, in effect, goofed off. I didn't concentrate enough. And that taught me a great big lesson, that when you want to do something, you got to really work at it and be disciplined and focused.
It was hard at that age, though, I think. Know that you want that focus. So you were involved then with a lot of track at Stanford, and now I know you've gone on to make some world records, am I right?
Yeah, I'm still running. I'm going to run in a track meet 7 days from now in Modesto, or less than 7 days. And I quit running after I graduated from Stanford. And I sort of regretted for a while that I hadn't focused on golf or tennis or some sport you could keep doing. And then lo and behold, they started what's called senior track in 1968, where people of all different ages compete with each other. And I immediately got back into track and started competing. They keep world's records by age groups, and I set the world's record for a while for 55-year-olds in the 100-yard dash. Some scoundrel from Hawaii broke my record shortly thereafter, and I haven't managed to get it back.
Keep working on it, maybe next week.
Maybe.
So you continued then at some point back with the track, and how about as far as I know that you were the editor even of the Mountain View high school newspaper, the Eagle?
Yeah.
Was that your first experimentation with journalism, or had you started
I guess it was. My father commuted on the train. We used to have a wonderful train that went from Los Gatos to San Francisco.
On the
twice
electric
going
one,
up and then twice coming back. And my father commuted to San Francisco for a while. He was in business in Palo Alto, but then he started working in San Francisco for a while. And he became the seatmate every day of Fremont Older, a famous editor who edited the San Francisco Bulletin, later the Call Bulletin. And that was one of the reasons I got intrigued by journalism, meeting Fremont Older, who was a great Western editor, and hearing stories about remarkable events that he had covered, that his paper, Crusades, his paper had gotten into.
Oh, interesting. So did he kind of get you hooked when you were younger to have you do any writing, or you just thought of him as a great example?
That just got me sort of fascinated with newspaper work.
Well, I can see that. And I was fascinated to read about a lot of the journalism work you did during the pre-war time. Definitely tracking.
Yeah, I covered some pretty interesting events in those days.
And everybody should know you were one of the top 10 bestsellers with your book, The Killing of the Peace.
Right, way back in 1945.
It's wonderful.
That was a story about something that happened in the Senate where I eventually managed to get. I was always fascinated by the Senate. So, by what can be done there.
From a local aspect, when you did decide to pursue a career in public service and you went as the California Senator, what were your goals going into that?
Well, my first goal was to get us out of the Vietnam War, which was raging at that time, and I thought was a big mistake. And I did help get us out of there eventually. And beyond that, my primary interest was in peace. And I worked on arms control efforts and on trying to improve relations with the Soviet Union and prevent a nuclear war. I contributed a little bit to that. The main contributor, I think, was Mikhail Gorbachev, with whom I became very well acquainted. We developed a friendship while he was the leader of the Soviet Union and I was in the Senate. And now I'm chairman of his foundation in the United States. We have our office up in the Presidio, and I'm still working quite intimately with him. He's a wonderful man.
Oh, that's great. And yeah, will that be interesting for us to hear a little more about the Gorbachev?
Well, the foundation's set up to give Gorbachev a base of operations, like Jimmy Carter has his center and Ronald Reagan has had his library and Nixon and Bush have had their libraries. It's designed to give him the backup staff wherewithal to continue to play a leading and constructive role in the world, which he's endeavoring to do, and I think he's doing it very effectively.
That's great to hear. And you had mentioned earlier that coming up in the fall is a
Well, this fall, in late September and the first day of October, Gorbachev is convening, with our help, a State of the World Forum in San Francisco to talk with world leaders. He's assembled a group, unlike any other person could bring together, of leaders like Maggie Thatcher, George Bush, and philosophers and Nobel Prize winners and scientists and people, just to talk about what is the state of the world and what can we do to improve it and what can we do to prevent deterioration of the world society. And we hope it will be constructive. And Gorbachev's coming with many ideas, so are many other people. It's going to be, I think, a very useful exercise, and we hope it will be the beginning of sort of creating a world brain trust that will continue to think about the next millennium and where the world and humanity ought to try to go in the next century.
Well, where do you see that? I know, of course, that you've had a big impact on environmental issues and human rights and world peace. Where do you see things going from here?
Well, we have to work on all of those issues and a lot of other issues. But we need, I believe, to strengthen the UN so we can use it to help keep the peace in the world. The UN is criticized a lot because it doesn't perform too effectively. Well, it doesn't perform too effectively because we haven't given it the wherewithal to be effective. So that's one thing I think we should do. I know there's a lot of concern about government now, and government has gotten perhaps too big and tried to do too much and made a lot of mistakes. But we still need government. We need it in Los Altos and Santa Clara County, in California, in the nation. And we need to have some way of making decisions in the world, which we don't really have now. It's anarchy when you get beyond your borders.
So I hope this really starts things off in a good direction then.
We hope to.
Well, you alluded to Los Altos government, and I know that we talked a little bit about your role with the incorporation of the city. And while you weren't too involved with that at the time, you were very involved with some other major
Well,
things.
I sort of led the way to creating the parking plaza in Los Altos. We were losing business to shopping centers because it was impossible to park in Los Altos in the 1950s, early. But we didn't have any sewers then in Los Altos. We had septic tanks behind the places of business, and that was just open dirt, which you couldn't park on in the winter. Maybe you could in the summer, but it was totally chaotic. We developed the concept of getting rid of the sewers and getting rid, rather, of the septic tanks, bringing in sewers, and then paving them over with the parking plaza that we now have. And we succeeded in putting that over, and that led to, in effect, turning Los Altos into a shopping center, making it relatively easy to park, and having stores with two fronts, one toward the street and one toward the rear. Now, Los Altos has grown so much that we again have a parking problem, and there were some advocates of building a big parking garage. I hope that won't happen. I think it wouldn't look too good.
It might kind of change the feel.
If we do have to do something about parking, it ought to be underground. Maybe it's more expensive, but it would be a lot better and preserve the character of the city.
That's a good idea. So we'll see you getting that accomplished
next. I don't know how
next,
active
right?
I'll get in that, but I'm advocating that approach.
So I'm curious, as we talk about your fascinating life and spanning all of these different things, and have you seen a huge change in the face of Los Altos then?
Oh yes, I have. When I first remember seeing Los Altos, the main street was dirt. There were horse hitching posts every 10 feet or so down the street around Main Street. There were big spaces between the buildings. There was mainly, there are three buildings that I recall that still exist. The first are on the corner of Main Street and First Street, on both main corners.
Okay.
And then down at the corner of Second Street, it would be the northwest corner. There's another building that dates back to those days. And those were about all that were there. And then the next block there were houses. I remember there was a nice old shingled house that a Miss McCrum, who was a teacher, lived in. She just had to walk about 150 yards to be at school from that home.
Oh, it's not there anymore?
No. Oh. No, it's all stores now on Main Street.
Oh, she was right on
Yeah, she was
Main
right
Street.
smack on Main Street.
Oh, boy.
And then eventually we had a scout hall on First Street, a little bit south of Main Street. My father helped raise the money to build that. I was a member of the Boy Scouts.
Wow.
We used to have meetings there, and the railway train used to come through. The station was where there's now, the same building is now a restaurant. We used to go up there and play prisoner's base at night after the scout meetings.
That's great. And did you ride, how did you get to school when you eventually went to Mountain View High School? Did you take a train then?
No, there was a bus which I sometimes took, and then I had a little tiny old Chevrolet, and I used to drive that.
Pile other people in it too?
Yeah, sometimes.
Interesting. And so Main Street was very small, and a lot of the business then that you did was in Mountain View or Palo Alto?
Yeah, mainly, my mother used to drive into Palo Alto or take the train up to San Francisco to shop there.
Interesting.
Most people did that. There was a drugstore and a fountain, and there was a bakery, and there was a little grocery store, and there was a hardware store. And that was about all that I remember on Main Street in the original days. So if you wanted more than you could get there, you had to go to Palo Alto or up to San Francisco.
It's amazing to imagine now. And then when you were here in the 50s, you had left then during the war, and you came back to Los Altos during the 50s?
I was away being a foreign correspondent in 36 after I graduated from Stanford that year, 37, 38. Then I came back and I did various enterprises and jobs in Washington and New York.
Oh.
The war came along and I served in the Office of War Information, which was in the executive offices of the president for the first part of the war. Then I declined the deferment, enlisted in the Army, served in the Army till the war ended. And then I did some work in Washington for a couple more years, and then I came back to California, hoping to get into politics, but having to make some money first. And I joined my father in real estate for a time in Palo Alto. I was living then in Los Altos. Got very active in the Democratic Party, beginning when Harry Truman ran for president to be elected on his own right in '48. I had met Adlai Stevenson during the war, and when he ran for president, I was very active in his campaign in 1952, and that was the beginning of my real activities in politics.
How fascinating. Interesting. So you were here in the 50s, and then you ended up going to Sacramento.
Yes, I was here, lived here from I lived here a little bit in the late 40s. Then I went back east to be president of the United World Federalists for 3 years. And then I moved back to California in '52 and was here living in Los Altos until '58 when I got elected state controller.
So in those short 6 years, you got all the parking fixed.
Yeah. Then I moved to Sacramento in 1959. My mother had been born in Sacramento, incidentally.
Oh, and I think I read that your parents were married very near to where you
Yes, they were.
Ended up.
They were married in a home that was the nearest private property to the office that I was in the state capitol while I was state controller. I was in one corner and the governor was in the other corner facing a park there.
So when did you make the decision that you wanted to focus in the Senate? Is that kind of always the goal?
That was really the goal I had when I quit journalism in 1938 in Europe and came back. I thought being in the Senate would be the greatest opportunity to be involved in world events and in national events. When I was in state government, in the controller's office, I was limited primarily to state matters, but I've always been interested in national and world events, and that was what attracted me to the Senate.
I think it would be interesting to hear a little about what your major accomplishments were in the Senate.
Well, helping get us out of Vietnam was one. Probably the longest lasting accomplishments relate to creating parks and wilderness areas where part of the world as it was created is going to be preserved forever. So that will last. When you pass a bill dealing with a war-peace problem or a social issue or a tax or economic issue, new problems immediately come along, sometimes created by the solution to some other problem, and it's forgotten. But when you protect a wilderness or a wild river or a beach or a seashore or a redwood forest, that's forever.
Yeah.
I got a lot of that done.
When you initiated the California
Desert Bill. That's one of the two unfinished pieces of business that I hadn't quite accomplished when I left the Senate. I'd carried it a long way and helped start it. And Dianne Feinstein picked it up and did a very good job of finishing and getting the Desert Bill. And then another thing just very recently happened. There's a beautiful estate in Woodside to the left of 280 up into the mountains. Beautiful redwood trees and streams and so forth. And we managed to get that put into the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, so it will now be there forever. It's got beautiful trails, wonderful place to hike.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that is something I can see that's long-lasting accomplishment. And so now moving into what you're working on now, we've talked about the Gorbachev Foundation, and you're also involved in another enterprise in the Asia,
well, I'm
Central
involved in venture capital investing activities in Kyrgyzstan, which is a country most people have never heard of. It's a brand new country that emerged out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. 15 new countries were born when the Soviet Union broke up, and one of them was Kyrgyzstan, which I then proceeded to visit while I was still in the Senate. And they have a wonderful president in that country named Askar Akayev, who's the most democratic-minded of all the new presidents of the 15 countries. Some of them are by no means pro-democracy, they're dictatorship types. But he's trying to create a democracy and doing pretty well at it. And I've been trying to help him in various ways, including getting American capital invested in the country.
That's wonderful.
It's very exciting to be doing. Way, way off on the border of China, close to the Himalayan mountains.
I remember seeing it on one of the newer maps. So, oh, well, that's great. So it's carrying a lot of the things that were really important in your political life through now and helping with human rights and democracy.
Right.
That's wonderful. And then we know you're still running. And how about writing? Are you still doing any?
Yeah, I'm still writing. A lot of people have suggested I write a book. Well, I don't need to because my sister wrote a beautiful book as far as about my life is concerned. But I did one book once upon a time. I did a second book that was an unauthorized version of Mein Kampf that caused Adolf Hitler to sue, in effect sue me and some other people that were involved in it. But more recently I've been writing for Rolling Stone and for the Christian Science Monitor and some other publications.
Wonderful. About experiences that you've had or the...
No, for Rolling Stone I did one article about Gorbachev. I did another article about Robert Dole, the Republican leader in the Senate, and potential presidential candidate. For the Christian Science Monitor, I wrote about Kyrgyzstan and President Akayev.
Oh, okay.
And I did an article about Mongolia, which is about as far away as you can get. I'm the only senator that ever visited Mongolia.
Really?
I think Paul Simon of Illinois eventually got there, so two of us have now been there. But that's a fascinating place, way, way off, landlocked between China and Russia. And it's where Genghis Khan came from.
I knew that. Interesting. So, and you're now back in the Los Altos area.
Yes.
So that's good. We're glad to have you back now.
It's great to be back. I love it here.
I should show, I know you'd mentioned your biography, so I wanted to show everyone here in case you want to learn more about Alan Cranston. This was a book written by his sister, and I've recently read it. It's wonderful.
Good, glad you think so.
So that will get them studying.
I call it the world's greatest biography.
It's not bad. Well, and I did want to ask you sort of in closing a little bit, I think it's interesting that you're involved with the Gorbachev Foundation and maybe a little bit of what you do hope to see, or where you see the state of our country being, and where you hope to see us go globally, maybe a little of what you're going to bring to the conference in the fall.
Well, I hope to see the United States stay involved in the world, and we have to. There's no way to avoid it, whether we like it or not, and to provide leadership toward a more orderly world and toward the spreading of democracy and human rights and a free economy, but recognizing that there has to be some kind of a safety net for people that get left behind. That's what we should be doing, I think. And avoiding having government intervene in too many personal matters where people should have their own choices. The more that can be left to individuals and families to make their own decisions, better. But there's some things they can't do alone, and that's why we have government.
That sounds good. Well, it's been wonderful having you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you and with whoever's been watching.